No more Mr. Nice Guy.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening again, wherever you are. This is part 2. It's mid-evening on the 24th of May here in the United Kingdom. And my computer decided to die on me. Or my Streamlabs did anyway. So, what's the history of this conflict? The conventional wisdom in the West, and this is certainly true in places like Britain and the United States, is that Vladimir Putin is responsible for this crisis. It's the Russians. We're the good guys. They're the bad guys. And of course, this is simply wrong. The United States and its allies, but mainly the United States, are wholly responsible for this crisis. Not Putin, not Russia. And why do I say that? It's very important to understand that what the West has been trying to do since 2008 is turn Ukraine into a Western bulwark on Russia's border. And that policy has 3 dimensions to it. The first, and the most important, is NATO expansion. The idea was that we were going to expand NATO eastward to include Ukraine. Good old West. Well, like the Wild West. The second element of this strategy was EU expansion. So in other words, it was not just NATO expansion. The second string to the violin was to include Ukraine into the EU. And the third element of the strategy was the colour revolution. And in the case of Ukraine, that colour was orange. The idea was to turn Ukraine into a liberal democracy like Britain, like America, and not only a liberal democracy, but a liberal democracy that's allied with the United States. Because again, this is all part and parcel of a strategy that's designed to make Ukraine a Western bulwark on Russia's border. I said the most important element of the whole strategy was NATO expansion. And that's why the April 2008 Bucharest NATO summit is of immense importance. At the end of that summit in April 2008 at Bucharest in Romania, NATO announced in the official briefing that Georgia and Ukraine would become part of NATO. They said, this is going to happen, period. The Russians made it unequivocally clear at that point that that is not going to happen. They drew a line in the sand. As background, there were 2 big tranches of NATO expansion before that 2008 meeting. The first tranche was in 1999, which included Poland, Hungary and the Czech Republic, all very close, if not on, the border of Russia. Then there was a second tranche in 2004, 5 years later. That included countries like Romania and the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia. And the Russians swallowed those 2 NATO expansions. They didn't really have much choice. They were a very weak country at the time. They intensely disliked both of those expansions, but they swallowed them. But when NATO said in 2008 that expansion would now include Georgia and Ukraine, Putin and Russia drew a line in the sand. It's very important to understand that they said, this is not happening. And just a few months later, it's no accident in August 2008 that you had a war between Russia and Georgia. Remember, Georgia's the other country besides Ukraine that was going to be brought into NATO. Russia said that ain't happening. Georgia decided to poke the bear, give it a kick, thinking that NATO would come to its aid. There was a war in August 2008, and NATO did not help Georgia. Then in February 2014, February 22nd to be exact, the crisis broke out over Ukraine. And it was mainly precipitated by a coup in Kiev, in the government. Ukraine overthrew a democratically elected pro-Russian leader. A lot of people claim that he wasn't democratically elected. Well, I'll put it this way. In the previous election, he wasn't democratically elected, and it was very, very quickly rerun. And in this election where he was democratically elected, he became the president of Ukraine. He might have been a despot, he might have been corrupt, but he was democratically elected. And then Russia installed a pro-American leader, Poroshenko. And the United States was wholly involved in that coup. Putin went ballistic, and it's hardly surprising. He did two things. First, Russia took Crimea. Why? There's a very important naval base called Sevastopol on Crimea, which housed the Russian Navy. There was no way the Russians were going to let Sevastopol become a NATO naval base. Just not going to happen. That's the principal reason Russia took Crimea. Other than it's one of the only two warm water ports that Russia has access to. The second thing Russia did was to take advantage of a civil war that broke out in eastern Ukraine almost immediately after the February 22nd coup. Russia made sure their allies in the Donbass and Lugansk regions, who are mainly Russian speakers and in many cases Russian ethnicity, Russia made sure they were not defeated by the Ukrainian government or the Ukrainian army. Russia, their goal was in fact to wreck Ukraine. The Russians are basically saying, we will wreck Ukraine before we allow Ukraine to become a member of NATO. So the Russian response is very important to understand. In 2014, when the crisis first broke out into the open, in response to what happened in Bucharest in 2008, the Russian response was twofold. Number one, they took Crimea. And you should all understand, Crimea is never going back to Ukraine. Number two, they have said implicitly they will destroy Ukraine. And this was all on the basis that they drew a line in the sand in 2008. They will wreck Ukraine before they let it become a member of NATO. So the question you need to ask yourself is why? Why are the Russians doing this? Why is it such a big problem? Well, this is Realpolitik 101. And the fact that people in the West, especially in places like Britain and the United States, don't understand this just boggles my mind. I just don't understand the idea that you could take a military alliance run by the United States, the most powerful state in the world, and place it right up against Russia's borders, and the Russians wouldn't be bothered by it. It's simply unthinkable. The United States has the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine says no distant great power is allowed to form a military alliance with a country in the Western Hemisphere, and is certainly not allowed to move military forces into the Western Hemisphere. If you consider the Cuban Missile Crisis, it becomes quite clear. What happened there is the Soviets put nuclear-tipped missiles in Cuba. The United States says, this is categorically unacceptable. They drew a line in the sand. Military forces from afar are not allowed in the Western Hemisphere. So we had the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the end result was those missiles were removed when the Soviets related talking about building a naval base in Cuba, and United States told them in no uncertain terms, you're not building a naval base in Cuba. Just not going to happen. The United States views the Western Hemisphere as its own backyard, and it prohibits distant great powers from coming into it, into its backyard. The Monroe Doctrine. Likewise, unless you're a hypocrite, don't you think the Russians are going to be deeply disturbed by the United States turning Ukraine into a bulwark right on Russia's borders? Of course they are. And the Russians told us this immediately after the Bucharest summit. They made it categorically clear Ukraine is not going to become part of NATO. But of course, the Americans and their allies didn't listen, because we in the West, we believe we're the good guys. The USA is a benign hegemon, can do pretty much anything it wants in the world. And for a while it looked like they could get away with it. The Russians accepted the first NATO expansion in 1999 and the second one in 2004. But after Bucharest, they said this is not happening. So we ended up with this major crisis that broke out in February 2014 in Kiev. That crisis tamped down quite a bit after 2014. But in autumn 2021, it began to ramp up again. And of course, early 2022, it became a full-blown conflict. And the question we need to ask ourselves again is what happened here and why? Why all of a sudden did this crisis go from the back burner right to the front? And the answer is that the United States and its allies were effectively turning Ukraine into a de facto member of NATO. You'll hear lots of rhetoric today that the Russians really had nothing to worry about because nobody was talking about making Ukraine a member of NATO today. But if you look at what the West was actually doing, it's a different story. Words versus actions. First of all, going back to the Trump administration and continuing into the Biden administration, we've been arming Ukraine. We weren't arming Ukraine during the Obama administration in February 2014 when the crisis broke out. And in the first few years after that crisis, when Obama was in power, America refused to arm the Ukrainians because Obama knew it would enrage the Russians. It would scare the hell out of them. You need to understand that the Russians view Ukraine becoming a part of NATO as an existential threat. Their existence is being threatened. And that is what's going on here. So the Russians are now sending a very clear message to the West. They're telling us, we take this threat seriously. And we're willing to use military force if necessary to eliminate the threat. The Russians, they're not fooling around here. So what we had happening in 2021, and of course it started before that under Donald Trump, is we were arming the Ukrainians. And when you start talking about arming the Ukrainians, Those Ukrainian forces that can fight against Russia's allies in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, in Lugansk. One thing that really spooked the Russians was that the Turks gave the Ukrainians drones. And drones have become a very effective weapon on the battlefield, as the Azerbaijanis proved against the Armenians last year. And the Azerbaijanis were using the same Turkish drones, Bayraktars. So the Turks are giving drones that they believe, based on past experience, are good in conflicts. The Americans and the British are giving all sorts of other weapons to the Ukrainians. The rest of the EU is giving all sorts of aid, a lot of it being military aid. But the West defines these weapons as defensive. But of course, we all know there's no such meaningful distinction between defensive weapons and offensive weapons. Trying to make such a distinction to the general populace is just pure propaganda. When you consider your security, what looks defensive to us looks offensive to others. If you give military-grade drones to the Ukrainians, do you think the Russians are going to view those as defensive weapons? I don't think so. You start training the Ukrainian forces the way the British and the Americans do. You don't think the Russians are going to see that as a threat? I can guarantee they are. So what's happening here is we're arming and training the Ukrainians. And if you look at how we're dealing with Ukraine diplomatically, we're basically talking about Ukraine as if it's an ally or a partner. So it looks like diplomatically and militarily the bonds between the West, especially the United States of America, and Ukraine are tightening. At the same time, we're doing a number of provocative things outside of Ukraine that really bothers the Russians enormously. In June 2021, Britain sailed a destroyer through Russian territorial waters in the Black Sea. The Americans flew a bomber right up against the Russian coastline in the Black Sea. This really bothers the Russians, unsurprisingly. So what you see happening here is the Russians have a very powerful sense that NATO is moving eastwards. And it's quite scary for them. NATO is moving right up to the Russian border, mainly by turning Ukraine into a de facto member of the NATO alliance, but also with other provocative measures like the British destroyer and this American bomber. Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said Russia had reached boiling point. They'd had enough. If it walks like a duck, if it quacks like a duck, it's a damn duck. And Russia, well, they're just not really interested in negotiating anymore. They've done that for 14 years. And further back than that, since the late 1980s, when the Soviet Union broke up, Gorbachev received written assurances, allegedly, or verbal assurances, that NATO would never move further east. And we've seen that agreement was broken by the West within 10 years. They pretty much had to take on the chin whatever's been thrown at them. But given they see their very existence as being threatened, Russia is now interested in altering the status quo. The end result is in early February 2022, we had this massive military build-up on both sides. And Russia commenced its special military operation on February the 24th. It's doing enormous damage to the Ukrainian economy, which was already a basket case before the crisis. So Ukraine's situation is getting worse and worse. And Russia's intent is to destroy Ukraine's capabilities if it refuses to back down. And Russia doesn't mind wrecking Ukraine, because anywhere can come back. The Russians have sent a very clear signal to the West. If the West ups if the West ups the ante, the Russians will respond. And again, Ukraine is not becoming a part of NATO. And the latest from Russia is that Ukraine's not joining the EU either. Originally, Russia didn't have a problem with anybody joining the EU, an economic union. But given the way that the EU has treated Russia during the period of this special military operation, they are now seen as unfriendlies. So Ukraine will not be joining the EU either. Frankly, the EU could never afford it anyway. Not now that they've lost one of their biggest net contributors in the UK. Germany, France, Italy, they can't afford to take on the requirements, the financial requirements of Ukraine or Georgia. So that's where we are today. We have this major crisis which goes back, really, to April 2008. That's the genesis. That 2008 NATO statement to make Ukraine a member of NATO made Russia sit up and take full notice. And Russia warned the West and Ukraine, line in the sand, this is not happening. You're not going to do it. The West and Ukraine completely ignored Russia, continued on their singular course, didn't care about Russia's security concerns, which is exactly what a country that's a hegemon like the USA does. A unipolar hegemon, thinking they can do anything in this world and nobody can challenge them. Well, we're heading to a multipolar world. Russia is going to be a peer competitor. China's going to be a peer competitor. And what is the USA going to do? We had a crisis broke out on the 22nd of February 2014. Over time, it was ameliorated, somewhat pushed to the back burner despite 14,000 deaths in the ethnic Russian area of the east of Ukraine. Then all of a sudden, conflict breaks out again, as it usually does. So, is there any hope we can settle this crisis? Here's one obvious solution. Probably politically unacceptable right now, but in time, the obvious solution is to turn Ukraine, or what will be left of it, into a neutral state. A buffer between Russia on one side and NATO, stroke the EU, on the other. It protects both sides. It's of benefit to all sides. And it's effectively what we had up until February 2014, since 1991. But the ultranationalist Ukrainians will not accept that, because Russia is very unlikely to return the south or east of Ukraine now. And they certainly won't give Crimea back. Now, much of that monologue doesn't actually come from me. It's not really any use for anyone trying to argue with me about it. In general, at least 95% of those words are from one of the top US professors of international relations, Professor John Mearsheimer from the University of Chicago. He's been talking about this very issue, Russia and USA, as well as China, USA's hegemony, unipolar world, international relations, how USA needs to actually react and play the game, seeing as they see themselves as this big leader, this dominator that tells everybody what to do. He's been talking about these things for many years now, since before the turn of the century. And he's been proven right so far. By the turn of the century, everybody thought things were all really cool. It's all idealistic. There's no good reason to be a realist international relations theorist. Everyone's idealistic. Everybody's getting on well together. Nobody wants to fight anymore. It's just too dangerous. The reality of the situation is, if you push big players too much, they're going to bite back. None of what I've said here, none of what John Mearsheimer says, is about being pro-Putin, pro-Russia, Russian propaganda, or a Putin puppet. This is the objective stance of people who are experts in the area and understand international relations and power politics, states politics, realpolitik, rather than emotional knee-jerk reactions of the people who want there to never be wars. That's why we keep seeing all this stuff in the newspapers about how bad it is that somebody died. That's what happens in wars. Maybe there never should have been a war. Absolutely. But it was caused by the United States of America, by NATO, and by the ultra-nationalism and fascism of the Ukrainians, who believed that they had these people behind their backs. And maybe they were told, NATO will come and help you. We will be there. We'll be in there immediately if Russia does anything. Maybe they were told this. But I don't know whether people have seen the clip of a video that I showed earlier of Michael Fall, who's the ex-US ambassador to Russia, who basically say, what diplomats do is lie. That's what they do. So you can't believe anything that they say, ever. But Ukraine believed them. So the actions of the West and the United States of America have long been to instigate conflict and to aggravate and undertake proxy wars, merely so that they can then claim innocence, claim they're merely defensive, and they blame the state that they have bullied for years, for decades. They've had this hate for these people for so long, and they build up this culture within all of their own countries that these other countries are bad, bad, bad. They're naughty countries. The people are horrible. They're not really human. They dehumanize them. And when these people react, eventually, the West jumps on board with the propaganda. See, told you they were bad. Look what they're doing now. I'm not a hypocrite. I know this was all the USA's doing, NATO's doing. NATO, 1988, 1989, when the USSR disappeared, fell apart. No longer were all these countries all together in this communist society. No more. NATO suddenly had an existential crisis of their own. NATO needed to maintain hate against Russia to justify their own existence. And the United States of America, as the people, pushing NATO, leading NATO, the dictator of the West, the dominator. They made sure there had to be an enemy, and they've got two enemies, China and Russia. And they're looking at China and Taiwan all over again. Joe Biden today or yesterday has just been talking about if China does something with Taiwan, then we're going to do this. Is it just lies? Is it that diplomatic lie all over again? Can you imagine what America would be able to do on the backyard of China? Very bloody little, I can tell you. China will have all the supply lines, all the supply chains. China will be able to resupply with people, with ammunition, with ordnance, with tanks, with absolutely everything if they chose to do this. And where would America be? A month away? 2 weeks away? Having to go there on boats? What would they do? It's time to open your eyes. Your governments are not the idealists you think they are. Your loyalty is mere puppetry.
No more Mr. Nice Guy.